Julian Hayes was only a line cook at Whitmore Crown, a widowed father who kept his head down and his hands steady, so when he reached out and touched a white truffle worth $5,000, the room seemed to freeze in place. Eleanor Whitmore, the young chief executive of the entire Whitmore hospitality chain, turned just in time to see his fingers close around the pale, fragrant lump sitting inside its glass case. In front of a dozen investors, in front of the chef everyone admired, she felt something in her chest snap shut. She did not ask what he was doing. She did not wait for an explanation. She simply pointed toward the door and said the words that would end his job before the sentence was even finished. Minutes later, the kitchen would be in chaos. The chef would vanish without a trace, and the truffle itself would prove to be worthless. But by then, Julian would already be gone, walking out into the New York rain with nothing left to lose. Stay until the end, because the man everyone dismissed that night was the only person standing between Eleanor Whitmore and the collapse of everything she had built. Whitmore Crown occupied the ground floor of a limestone building in Manhattan, a restaurant so exclusive that a single table could cost more than most people earned in a week. Inside its kitchen, beneath gleaming copper pans and rows of imported knives, worked a small army of ambitious young chefs who had trained under some of the most celebrated names in the country. Julian was not one of them, at least not in the way anyone there understood. He arrived before sunrise, checked deliveries, sharpened blades that were not his own, and spent his days elbow deep in prep work that required no name tag and earned no applause. He rarely spoke about himself, and when the younger cooks teased him for being past 30 and still peeling vegetables, he let the comments slide off him like water. His only real ambition each night was to finish his shift, take the train home, and call his daughter before she fell asleep. He never mentioned that he had once cooked in front of judges who called him a prodigy. He never told anyone that his hands, which now scrubbed pots and portioned herbs, had once shaped dishes that critics wrote about for weeks. Lucas Grant, the restaurant's manager, noticed things about Julian that no one else seemed to care about. He noticed that Julian could tell if a fish had been sitting too long simply by the way it smelled from 3 feet away, or that he could judge the ripeness of a peach without ever touching it. Once, when a shipment of oysters arrived with a faint, wrong odor, Julian quietly pulled them from the line before anyone else even noticed a problem. Jason Knox, the executive chef of Whitmore Crown, took the credit in front of Eleanor without hesitation, then turned to Julian afterward and warned him coldly never to interfere with decisions that were not his to make. There was something unspoken between the two men, a tension that ran deeper than rank or title, though Julian never explained it and Jason never allowed the subject to be raised twice. Julian avoided confrontation not out of weakness, but because he understood that certain doors, once reopened, could never be closed again. On the evening everything changed, Eleanor walked through the kitchen doing her final check before the most important dinner of the year, reminding her staff that Bennett Capital was prepared to invest tens of millions of dollars if the night went perfectly. The centerpiece of the evening's menu was a white Alba truffle imported directly from Italy, valued at $5,000, and Jason had promised her it would be the dish that convinced Catherine Bennett to sign the contract. The truffle sat inside a locked glass case, kept under a strict temperature that only Jason was supposed to control. When a kitchen assistant opened the case to begin prep, Julian caught a smell that did not belong there, something faintly chemical beneath the earthy richness a real truffle should carry. He did not touch it right away. Instead, he quietly asked whether the storage temperature had been checked that morning. Jason brushed the question aside without looking up, reminding Julian that he was there to wash vegetables, not to question a chef who had won national awards. Julian studied the truffle from a distance and noticed that the moisture on its surface looked unnatural, and that the soil clinging to its skin carried the wrong shade of brown for anything grown in the hills of Alba. A quiet suspicion began forming in his mind, one he could not yet prove but could not ignore either. Lucas mentioned, almost in passing, that Jason had returned to the walk-in cooler alone the previous night, long after the rest of the staff had gone home. Julian understood that if the truffle in that case was fake, or worse, contaminated, then whatever dish came out of that kitchen could put a paying guest at real risk. He tried to find Eleanor to raise the concern, but she was occupied with investors near the front of the house and had no patience for interruptions. Jason ordered the truffle carried to the prep station, and when a younger cook lifted a knife to begin slicing it, Julian stepped forward and stopped his hand before the blade could touch the surface. He picked the truffle up himself, turned it slowly in his palm, checked the base where the stem had been cut, and drew it close enough to smell properly. What he found confirmed his fear. This was a common summer truffle coated in an artificial scent meant to mimic something far more valuable, and it was not the truffle the restaurant had paid $5,000 to import. Jason's voice rose instantly, accusing Julian of breaking protocol by touching an ingredient of that value without authorization. The commotion carried far enough that Eleanor and Catherine Bennett both stepped into the kitchen to see what had caused the disturbance. Eleanor arrived to find Julian holding the truffle in his bare hand, while Jason insisted the man had taken it from its case without permission. Julian tried to explain that the ingredient had been switched, that what sat in his palm was not what the restaurant had purchased, but his words came out too fast, too raw, and carried none of the polish Jason had built his reputation on. Jason produced an import certificate on the spot, waving it in front of Eleanor as proof, and accused Julian of inventing a story to cover for his own carelessness. Eleanor, already strained by the weight of the evening and the fortune riding on it, chose to believe the celebrated chef standing beside her rather than a quiet employee she barely knew by name. Catherine Bennett said nothing, but she watched Julian closely, noting that his hands did not shake and his eyes did not dart the way a guilty man's usually did. She had spent decades reading people across boardroom tables, and something about his stillness did not match the panic Jason described. Still, she remained silent, letting the moment unfold without interference, curious to see how the young chief executive would handle it. Eleanor told Julian to set the truffle down and step away from the station immediately. Julian offered to cut into the core in front of everyone to prove what he had found, but Jason objected instantly, warning that slicing it prematurely would ruin the ingredient before service. In front of the staff, in front of the investors, in front of the woman whose approval could change the fate of the entire chain, Eleanor announced that Julian was terminated for violating kitchen procedure. She told him that anyone who could not respect an ingredient had no place in a restaurant of this caliber. Julian felt the words land somewhere deep, but he did not raise his voice or beg for reconsideration. He untied his apron, placed his employee badge on the counter, and quietly warned Eleanor not to serve that particular truffle to anyone that night. Jason laughed under his breath, telling the room that a line cook had no business lecturing an award-winning chef on how to run a kitchen. Julian looked at Jason directly and said that the past did not stay buried forever, no matter how carefully someone tried to bury it. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Jason's face, a crack in the composure he wore like armor. Eleanor caught the exchange and felt a flicker of doubt about whether these two men shared some history she knew nothing about, but she pushed the thought aside and instructed security to escort Julian from the building. Lucas mouthed a quiet apology as Julian passed, though he lacked the courage to say anything out loud in front of Jason. On his way out, Julian noticed Jason receive a text message on his phone, then slip his walk-in cooler access badge into his jacket pocket, rather than leaving it on the hook where it belonged. It struck Julian as strange, though he had no time to think further on it before the door closed behind him. He decided, standing in the rain outside, that whatever happened next inside that restaurant was no longer his concern, and that he would not return no matter what unfolded. His phone rang as he walked toward the bus stop, and he answered it briefly, telling the person on the other end that his shift had ended early and that he was fine. He offered no details about the humiliation he had just endured, choosing instead to protect the people who loved him from one more thing to worry about. Inside the restaurant, Eleanor forced herself to breathe past the unease settling in her stomach and returned to her guests, determined to keep the evening on track. Jason assured her the dish would go out exactly as planned, his confidence as smooth and polished as ever. Yet the moment the kitchen doors swung shut behind him, he quietly gathered his personal knives, slipped his phone into his coat, and tucked a thick envelope of cash into his inside pocket, moving with the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed his exit long before that night began. Fewer than 10 minutes after Julian walked out into the rain, the walk-in cooler's refrigeration system failed without warning. A dozen ingredients meant for the evening's signature course sat exposed to temperatures they were never meant to endure. Jason disappeared from the building entirely, his phone switching off and his car no longer sitting in its reserved spot outside. The sous chef tried to step into his place, only to discover that the entire recipe file for the night's special menu had been deleted from the kitchen's computer system. A crucial base sauce had been mixed at the wrong ratio and had already begun to split. When someone finally cut into the truffle to salvage what they could, The interior revealed a dark, uneven core and a sharp chemical scent that confirmed everything Julian had tried to warn them about. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, the full weight of her mistake settling over her like ice water. Catherine Bennett was informed that the main course would be delayed, and she gave Eleanor exactly 30 minutes to resolve it before she walked out of the building for good. The investment was not simply a matter of money to Eleanor. It represented the livelihoods of hundreds of employees who depended on Whitmore Hospitality staying afloat. Lucas pulled up the security footage from the cooler and discovered that Jason had deliberately repositioned the camera angle earlier that week to create a blind spot. Behind an empty shipping crate, he found an invoice showing that the real Alba Truffle had already been sold, quietly and privately, to another buyer entirely. Eleanor realized in that instant that Jason had not simply made a mistake. He had stolen from the restaurant, sabotaged the kitchen, and planned his disappearance in advance. The sous chef suggested switching to a backup menu, but Catherine had specifically booked the evening around the truffle dish, and serving something else now would look like a deception rather than an accident. A junior cook, still shaken, mentioned that the only person who had ever fixed a broken sauce with a single taste without measuring or guessing was the man who had just been fired an hour earlier. Lucas remembered something he had heard Jason mutter once under his breath, a nickname he used only when he thought no one else was listening. Hayes. Catherine overheard the name and asked, with sudden sharpness in her voice, for Julian's full name. When she learned it was Julian Hayes, her expression changed entirely, because she remembered that name from nearly 8 years earlier, when a young chef by that name had shaken the entire culinary world before vanishing without explanation. Eleanor pulled up old articles on her phone and found headlines about a prodigy who had won a national competition, only to be accused of stealing another chef's recipe and disappearing from the industry soon after. The chef who had benefited most from that scandal, the one who rose to fame in the wreckage of Julian's disgrace, was Jason Knox. Catherine told Eleanor quietly that the most memorable dish she had ever eaten in her life had been prepared by Julian Hayes, years before any of this began. Eleanor understood with a sinking clarity that the only person capable of saving this night was the man she had just humiliated and thrown out into the storm. Without another word to her investors, she left the dining room and ran out into the rain to find him. Eleanor found Julian standing under the awning of a bus stop several blocks from the restaurant, his coat soaked through, his expression unreadable. She called his name twice before he finally turned to look at her, and even then he made no move to walk back toward her. When she asked him to come back, Julian asked her plainly whether she wanted him back as an employee or simply as a tool to salvage her contract. Eleanor admitted everything at once, that the truffle had been fake, that Jason had fled the building, and that the restaurant was on the verge of losing its most important deal. Julian did not gloat or savor the moment the way another man might have. His first question was whether any guest had already eaten the tainted ingredient. Even after everything, his instinct remained protecting people he had never met over protecting his own pride. Eleanor told him no one had eaten it yet, but that they had less than 25 minutes left before Catherine walked away for good. She offered to pay him any amount he named if he would return and fix what was broken. Julian refused, because the issue was never about money in the first place. He reminded her that she had condemned him publicly without bothering to check a single fact first. Eleanor tried to explain the pressure she had been under from the investors watching her every move, but Julian told her that pressure only revealed who a leader truly was underneath the polish. The words struck somewhere close to the center of everything she believed about herself. For the first time that night, her voice lowered, and the apology that followed was not calculated or strategic but plain and unguarded. She told him she was not asking him to save her own reputation, but to think of the employees who could lose their jobs if the deal collapsed. Julian still hesitated, aware that Jason may have left more traps behind than the single ruined truffle. His phone buzzed with a call from Lucas, who reported that the ingredients had been thrown into disarray and that a box of fresh local mushrooms had been delivered by mistake earlier that day. Julian asked for details about the mushrooms, along with whatever herbs, meat, and wine remained untouched in the kitchen. From ingredients that seemed unrelated and ordinary, a new dish began forming itself in his mind, built not around luxury but around honesty. He agreed to return, but only under 3 conditions. Eleanor would have to tell Catherine the full truth about the fake truffle, nothing unverified would be served to a single guest, and inside the kitchen every decision on food would belong to Julian alone until the crisis passed. Eleanor agreed without arguing a single point. When they walked back into the building together, the staff stared in disbelief at the sight of the man who had been fired an hour earlier now walking in beside their chief executive. In front of the entire kitchen, Eleanor admitted openly that she had been wrong and instructed every person present to follow Julian's direction without question. Julian did not reach for his old apron hanging by the door. Instead, he chose a plain white one with no title stitched into it, a quiet signal that he had come back to finish a job, not to accept his old position back as if nothing had happened. Julian moved through the kitchen methodically, discarding any ingredient that showed the slightest sign of tampering. He made the decision immediately not to attempt recreating the ruined truffle dish, since there was no honest way to fake what had already been lost. Instead, he began building something entirely new around the local mushrooms, browned butter, seared beef, and a reduced stock that had somehow survived the chaos untouched. The dish had to communicate something the restaurant had failed at all night. That honesty, not luxury, was what made a meal unforgettable. He reassigned tasks based on actual skill rather than title or seniority, something no one in that kitchen had experienced before. He noticed a young cook with real talent for sauces who had been quietly overlooked and dismissed under Jason's leadership, and gave her a critical role in the final dish, watching her confidence return within minutes. The sous chef, initially wary of taking direction from a man who had been fired hours earlier, was won over quickly by the speed and clarity with which Julian organized the room. Under his direction, the panic that had gripped the kitchen only an hour before began transforming into something close to order. Eleanor stood at the edge of the room, watching, and understood clearly for the first time that Jason had always led through fear, while Julian led by making people want to succeed for their own sake. Catherine demanded an explanation for the delay, and Eleanor walked out to face her directly, confessing without hesitation that the signature ingredient had been switched for a fraud. She told Catherine she was prepared to cancel the dinner entirely and refund every guest rather than continue with a lie. Catherine, intrigued rather than angered, agreed to wait and see what Julian could produce. Back in the kitchen, Julian tasted the sauce and detected a bitterness that did not belong, tracing it to a jar of seasoning that had been deliberately laced with an artificial additive. It confirmed something darker than simple theft. Jason had wanted the replacement dish to fail as well. Lucas checked the loading dock and spotted an unfamiliar man attempting to remove a box of documents from Jason's office. Security detained him, and inside his bag they found a plane ticket along with a duplicate set of the restaurant's financial records. Julian kept working through the discovery, refusing to let the unfolding scandal disrupt the rhythm of the kitchen. A brief memory surfaced of an incident 8 years earlier when Jason had sabotaged one of Julian's dishes during a competition, then stolen the recipe outright and accused Julian of copying his work instead. Without the money to fight a prolonged legal battle, and with his wife gravely ill at the time, Julian had walked away from the culinary world entirely, allowing Jason to claim victory by default. Eleanor learned this history from Catherine and finally began to understand why Julian had spent years avoiding any spotlight at all. Just as the final plates neared completion, the power in the kitchen cut out entirely, and Julian realized Jason had left behind a timed sabotage of the electrical system before disappearing. With only minutes remaining, the room fell into the dim glow of emergency lighting. The main stoves went dark, the ventilation system shut down, and heat began building rapidly inside the enclosed kitchen. Several staff members assumed the dinner was finished, convinced there was no way to recover from a total power failure this close to service. Julian remembered that the outdoor event kitchen used for garden functions still operated on an independent charcoal setup unaffected by the main building's power grid. He ordered the final stages of cooking moved there without hesitation. Eleanor herself helped carry pans and equipment across the courtyard, instead of standing back and giving orders from a distance. The sight of a chief executive in an expensive dress hauling cookware through the rain changed how her staff viewed her, perhaps permanently. Julian adjusted the dish on the spot to accommodate the new heat source, aware that cooking over open flame demanded far more precision than the ovens they had lost. Cooking over charcoal produced a deeper, richer flavor, but it left almost no room for error in timing. Julian asked Eleanor to stand beside him and track the seconds allowed in intervals of 30, turning her into an active partner rather than a passive observer. For the first time since they had met, the two of them worked side by side as equals, with no title or hierarchy standing between them. Using fresh mushrooms, browned butter, and the concentrated stock, Julian built a dish whose aroma echoed the missing truffle without ever pretending to be something it was not. He plated it simply, without theatrics, letting the food speak plainly rather than performing for the room. Before it left the kitchen, Eleanor asked what the dish was called. Julian told her it was named Second Chance, and something in the way he said it made clear the name meant more than just the recipe on the plate. Eleanor understood immediately that the name was not only for the restaurant but for her as well. The first plate was set in front of Catherine Bennett, and the entire dining room fell silent as she lifted her fork. She said nothing for a long moment, and Eleanor's stomach tightened, certain that the silence meant failure. Then Catherine asked who had created the dish, and Eleanor, without hesitation, refused to take any credit for herself and instead called Julian out from the kitchen. He walked into the dining room in his plain white apron, standing before the very people who had watched him get fired only hours earlier. Catherine declared that the dish bore no resemblance to the truffle course she had been promised, yet it felt more honest, more balanced, and more memorable than anything the original menu could have offered. She recognized, in the flavors before her, the same signature she remembered tasting years earlier from a chef whose name she had never forgotten. Even so, Catherine did not sign the contract on the spot. She told the room plainly that a single excellent dish could not erase the fact that this restaurant's management had proven vulnerable to corruption from within. Eleanor would have to prove she had the courage to expose the entire truth, not just serve a clever meal and move on. At that exact moment, Jason walked back through the front doors of the restaurant, his composure fully restored. He announced that he had only left the building because he felt threatened, and accused Julian of orchestrating the entire truffle switch as a scheme to steal his position. He arrived with a lawyer in tow and a contract claiming partial ownership over several of the chain's signature recipes. What had been a private crisis in the kitchen now became a public confrontation in front of everyone still seated in the dining room. Jason insisted that Julian had every motive for revenge, given how thoroughly his career had been destroyed years earlier. He waved old newspaper clippings that accused Julian of stealing a recipe, hoping the accusation would poison the room against him a second time. A few of the investors present exchanged uneasy glances, their trust in Julian wavering under the weight of Jason's confidence. Julian refused to argue with raw emotion the way Jason clearly hoped he would. Instead, he calmly requested that someone verify the creation dates on the digital recipe files, along with any surviving footage from the security cameras. Lucas produced backup footage from a hallway camera near the walk-in cooler, one that Jason apparently did not know still functioned. The recording showed unmistakably Jason removing the real truffle from its case, replacing it with the counterfeit, and handing the original off to an unfamiliar man near the loading dock. The stranger detained earlier that night admitted, once questioned, that Jason had paid him to steal the financial records and destroy any remaining evidence. Eleanor discovered, buried in those very records, that Jason had been inflating ingredient costs for nearly 2 years, quietly siphoning millions of dollars away from the company. Still, Jason clung to his accusation, repeating that Julian had also stolen a recipe years ago and deserved none of the sympathy in the room. Catherine insisted that the older matter be resolved as well before anyone moved forward. Julian revealed that he still owned a small notebook from his early training years, filled with dated sketches of the very recipe in question. He had not carried it that night for revenge, but simply because it remained a quiet memory of the life he had before his wife passed away. Eleanor sent an assistant to retrieve a small personal box Julian had left in the staff changing room earlier that evening. Inside it was an early draft of the disputed recipe, dated nearly 2 years before Jason had ever filed his own version. A letter from the National Chefs Association, tucked among the pages, showed that they had once offered to reopen the investigation, an offer Julian had never answered. Julian explained quietly that at the time he had been forced to choose between a drawn-out legal battle and staying beside his wife through her illness. He chose his family, even knowing it meant carrying an unfair reputation for years afterward. Jason sneered, calling that decision weak, a mistake made by a man who lacked the will to fight for what was his. Eleanor answered before Julian had to, saying that exploiting someone else's tragedy for personal gain was the true weakness in that room. It was the first time she had stood publicly and unmistakably on Julian's side, fully aware that doing so could damage her own company's reputation. Jason attempted to leave the building, but police had already been called based on the evidence of theft and fraud gathered that night. Before he was led away, he warned Eleanor that she would lose everything once the scandal became public. Eleanor answered that a company saved through lies was never worth saving in the first place. Catherine watched the entire exchange, witnessing a transformation in Eleanor that no rehearsed pitch could have manufactured. She agreed to move forward with the investment, though she demanded a complete restructuring of how the company handled its management and oversight. Eleanor turned to Julian and offered him the position of executive chef on the spot, in front of everyone still watching. Julian declined immediately, to the visible surprise of the entire room. He told her that one apology and one successful dinner were not enough to rebuild the kind of trust a real partnership required. In the days that followed, news of the counterfeit Truffle and the fraud beneath it spread quickly through the industry. Eleanor called a public press conference, taking full responsibility for trusting the wrong person and for firing Julian without ever verifying the truth. She refused to use Julian's story to promote the company unless he gave his explicit permission first. The company issued refunds to every client who had unknowingly paid inflated prices for ingredients over the past 2 years. Eleanor voluntarily closed 2 of the chain's restaurants temporarily to conduct a full audit of their supply systems. Several board members objected loudly, citing the enormous financial cost of the decision. Eleanor accepted the very real possibility that she might lose her position as chief executive in order to see the reforms through properly. Catherine, watching the concrete action rather than empty promises, approved the investment in staged phases tied to measurable progress. Lucas was placed in charge of building a new transparency system across every kitchen in the chain. Employees who had once been overlooked or intimidated under Jason's leadership were finally given real opportunities to prove what they could do. Julian returned to ordinary life, eventually taking a quiet job at a small local restaurant far from the spotlight. Eleanor never called him repeatedly or pressured him for a decision. Instead, she sent him a handwritten letter of apology, with no contract attached and no financial offer included. In the letter, she admitted that she had judged him by his uniform and his title, rather than by who he actually was. She wrote that saving the restaurant that night did not erase her mistake, but that it had taught her something essential about what real leadership required. A week later, Julian returned to Whitmore Crown on his own terms. He did not accept the executive chef position immediately, but proposed a 3-month trial instead, one that gave him authority to build an entirely new kitchen culture from the ground up. The most important condition he set was that any employee, regardless of rank, would have the right to report a safety concern without fear of retaliation. Eleanor agreed without hesitation and wrote the policy into the company's guidelines across every location. Julian also asked the company to fund a training program for chefs who had left the industry because of family circumstances, much like he once had. He wanted to give others the chance to return without enduring the same humiliation that had once driven him away entirely. Eleanor understood that this, more than any single dish, was how Julian had chosen to turn his own pain into something lasting. 3 months later, Whitmore Crown reopened under an entirely new system of management. Julian was no longer the invisible man working quietly in the corner of the kitchen. He became the restaurant's culinary director, though he still spent part of every shift working directly alongside the newest prep cooks and dishwashers, refusing to separate himself from the people who had once looked past him. The dish called Second Chance became the most requested item on the entire menu. On the printed page, it was described simply as a tribute to ordinary ingredients treated with extraordinary respect. Eleanor learned, slowly and deliberately, to walk into her own kitchens, to listen rather than simply to inspect. Her relationship with Julian grew gradually, built first on genuine respect rather than rushed sentiment or convenience. His daughter appeared only briefly, during a quiet dinner held after closing hours one evening, careful never to overshadow the larger story around her father. She told him plainly that his cooking tasted better than any $5,000 mushroom ever could. Eleanor laughed at that, and for the first time in a long while, Julian felt the weight of his past finally loosen its grip on him. A year later, the training program Julian had founded had already helped a number of former chefs return to the profession they thought they had lost forever. Catherine continued investing in the company, holding it up as an example of what transparency and accountability could actually look like in practice. Eleanor kept Julian's old employee badge inside her office desk, a quiet reminder never again to judge someone by the position they happened to hold. The story closed on an ordinary evening, as Julian lifted a freshly delivered white truffle in his palm, examining it the way he always did. This time, Eleanor did not stop him or question his hands. She only smiled, and asked the one person who understood that ingredient better than anyone else what they should cook together that night.